the same phrase out. So I'm so sorry, but there is a difference, and we'll look at a little bit about that again later. Can you see? It's fine. I'm good. Yeah. You be comfortable. I'm a bit too high. So that's like classic automatic speech recognition, speech to text, many names for it. So get the audio out and get the words out from the recording. And so we have this sort of idea from the past that you can basically do speech and language technology, like spoken dialogue systems, as a kind of chain that goes from speech to text. In the text domain, do natural language processing to do like dialogue management, figure out what the meaning is and things like that. And then if you want to make a response, go from text to speech. So the middle bit is all about text. But that kind of ignores a lot of stuff that's going on in speech. And this is from just last year. So this is when a lot of, I think Bali came out. So this is a speech synthesis system. And they were basically saying like, oh, look, we've solved speech now, right? By doing this chaining. And that, you know, in that, even that 1 year since, people are like, oh, actually, it's a lot more complicated. Even though people who worked on multimodality in speech know that it's a lot more complicated than that. So we're starting to get to the point where, you know, we're building spoken dialogue systems that we really want to take advantage of the speech aspects of this. Okay, so this slide again. So when we talk about prosody, we often talk about intonation. So the pitch of your voice, so how high or how low. So we measure this in the fundamental frequency, in the acoustic features. And we also talk about loudness, so the amount of energy in the speech, and things to do with timing. So how fast you're speaking, how long you're pausing for, and things like that. We also talk about voice quality. So is your voice harsh or is it breathy? And so we're just generally talking about suprasegmental properties of speech. So there's a structural element there, and there's some other stuff that we also need to account for. And yeah, the emojis, right? So we have a lot of stuff that's going on in speech that we try to convey in text in different ways. And it's kind of hard to actually just use text as in letters in English to express this. Okay, so here's this example again. Here's where it comes from. It's from this show, Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. If you've seen it, this is not an endorsement of this TV show, but it's too good an example to not learn. So here we go.
I'm so sorry. We really care that he's your friend. Could you guys be any cooler?
Oh no, Kimmy. The internet doesn't talk like that. The internet talks like Chandler.
What? No. I'm so sorry. We really care that he's your friend. Could you guys be any cooler? You can't tell when someone's being sarcastic on the internet.
So this is an example of how much you have to unpack when you're trying to figure out what's going on in speech. So I don't know, do people know the show Friends? Yeah. Okay. There's been a rebirth, right? So here's Chandler. You have to ask. He's being sarcastic on the internet. So here's Chandler. So here's an example of Chandler talking. And he's known for being sarcastic, of course. So here's a little clip of him.
Anybody know a good tailor?
You need some clothes altered?
No. I'm just looking for a man to draw on me with chalk.
So he has this draw on me with chalk, right? So this like pitch accent. That is indicative of sarcasm for him, but maybe not for everybody else. So if you think to yourself, like, how do I express sarcasm? It's probably not like Chandler, but he's very famous for this TV show, and so there's a cultural reference there. So in order to understand that whole segment from that TV show and what's going on when she's changing the way she speaks, you have to reference all of this sort of cultural information as well. Makes it very difficult. So let's just look at this a little bit again in terms of prosodic features. So if you just do the transcription, this looks the same. Kimmy and Kimmy as Chandler. If we look at how they sound when they're different, this is the clip I played for you before.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Just in front, and I've just taken the screenshot. I'm sorry. So, so you can see here the first. So I'm so sorry. Like it's quite short, and the second one is quite a lot longer. And you can see this blue pitch track here. the pitch is higher and is more pronounced fall here. There's also differences happening in the intensity and in some of the segmental content in terms of the duration, particularly. And the second line.
We really care that he's your friend. We really care that he's your friend.
So you can see the differences there as well. It's pretty clear. So this is very short, really, and there's a little break before there, and there's a much bigger pitch excursion on the really. Right. So in here, sarcasm and humor in general is thus discussed a lot in terms of incongruity. So there's some sort of incongruity between the text and how it's being said compared to some sort of norm. It's something that signals that you are not doing it in the normal way. So that might actually be just to make everything like monotone in some ways. But in this case, it's to make it more broad. And so I just wanted to show this because I found all these clips and and just to say that it's something that can affect, the way you speak can affect how things play out in real life. So this is about vocal fry, so a creaky voice. So here's an example of vocal fry. So it's a different type of voice quality.
Anne-Marie did wish you a happy birthday.
So you can hear that she's getting a bit creepy like this, right? So, getting looser vocal folds and things like that. And this is often a cause of worry. I mentioned uptalk a little bit in the other talk, but this is one that comes around quite often. Also in terms of being something that's associated with young women, and also a worry about whether it's something ruinous for your health for this also, and no, it's not. So it is. Yes, give it up the vocal fry. Maybe you're sounding too much like too much Kim Kardashian and Katy Perry. So this is from a few years ago. Is it creeping in from other places? All sorts of things like this. Yes, there's lots of this, and even in academic articles, people have studied whether this is something that affects the way people are perceived in life, and.
Was coming off of making The Last Jedi, which had been the best experience of my life.
That's Ryan Johnson. So he is a man, of course, and he also does it. Lots of men do it in the US and in various other places, but it's often associated with young. So I won't talk about vocal fry there, but it's just to give you the idea that these things are not just like an academic kind of funny thing about like how Chandler speaks. It is something that prosody at large is something that affects how we interact with the world. And so for today, I'll talk a little bit about representation learning for multimodal speech processing. So I'll talk about two things. So exploring prosodic variation with text-to-speech, so a little bit of more of what I talked about on the other talk for anybody who was there, but also a little bit more about like the work we've been doing on multimodal representation for speech for emotion recognition, affect-based tasks, because that has a longer history of trying to deal with multimodal representations. Okay, so just to flashback, so I want to first talk a little bit about what tools we're using nowadays, so what sort of representations we're using nowadays. And this is from 2016, so quite a long time ago. This is some work by my student then, Lainey Ten, but she's finished a long time now. So, but just to say that this is a sort of thing that different types of ways of thinking about how we put together data, right? So you want to think about if you have, say, a bunch of acoustic features, some features based on text, some features based on vision, you need to think about how you're going to put them together if you want to make predictions about things. And so in the middle neural network days of the last cycle of this, we talked about some different ways. So there's early fusion, so just put everything in together. So this could be your mean F0, your intensity measure, your duration measure, and something about the words in terms of their frequency or their looking up their values in their affect dictionary or something like that. So that's one way to do it, just chuck them all in together and then do some machine learning in the middle and then make an output. Another way is to make decisions separately for each modality and then make some judgment based on that. So that's often called late fusion or decision level fusion. And the one that we were advocating for was that we should add some structure in there, and that could improve things. So maybe think about how these modalities should fit together rather than just chucking everything in or together or just making decisions at the end. So when the neural models really hit, it gave us a lot of more flexibility about how to think about this. And this has changed again. But so many potential features. So how should we choose which ones to use, and how should we combine them? That's the main question. So here's some results from this work from a while ago. So the basic things to note here are that basically, if you use the we had really big acoustic feature sets. So this was a real massive one. It was like 1,000 something acoustic features, just everything people could think of, like from a signal processing point of view. And it didn't do like that well. If you just constrained it to this EGMAS feature set is one that's more that was basically handpicked. So it was like 88 features that people thought would help in motion recognition. It does better. And this one was quite bold proposal to just use 4 features, one based on basically spectral tilt measure and F0 and intensity measure, and even that does pretty well. It does better than trying to chuck in all the thousands. And we could see that there's some difference for this task. This is a motion recognition task we get better results in the end by doing some sort of feature fusion. So that's nice, and we get it better if we do the hierarchical version. So in this case, the motivation was to say, like, let's look at the level of granularity of the features naturally. So the acoustic features are generally on the frame level for this case. So drawing out every like 10 milliseconds or something like that. The lexical features are at a longer time scale. So let's build them up individually. And one thing that was kind of interesting is that these are basically some disfluency features. So some counts of different types of disfluencies that happen in utterances. Things like that, and repeats, fill pauses, prolongations, that sort of thing, and not that many features, but they actually help quite a lot. But if you just chuck them in all at the beginning, they kind of get lost. So that was the motivation for doing this kind of hierarchical structure. So that's good. We had some, it was like a. Layman did try and see whether if we just mixed up the hierarchical structure, whether we got something better, and we were like, no, it didn't work out better. So that was for her thesis, right? But there's still some idea like, well, we're kind of just winging it at this point. We'd like to think about different ways that we could put things together. And then that kind of fell into the way that people are thinking about things now, about learning different ways to combine different modalities. So I'll just go through a little bit about neural networks for language modeling again, very quickly, but just to say that the main thing that, since that work, the main innovation / thing that has taken over is the idea of using attention. So the idea that you do sequence modeling, first of all, so that you build up a representation of a sequence by, in this case, kind of passing along information through each item, backwards and or forwards. And then at the same time, if you're doing decoding, so just say you're encoding a sequence, so maybe a sentence in French, if you're going to then do translation and decode it into English, you might need to look at different parts of the sentence at different times when you're decoding it. So it's not a one-to-one mapping between the elements. So you don't want to map zone to the corresponding word in English, which would be European. They kind of, there's some reversal that happens there. Okay, and then so there's self-attention, and so we'll see a little bit about this again later, but the idea is that you can attend to many things take into account many things in a very long sequence, and you can weight them differently, and you can do this kind of dynamically for every position in the sequence. And so this is your transformer. So when people talk about transformers, they're basically talking about this, encoding, doing some self-attention, and so rather than once one language in, another language out, we're basically just doing it on the same set. Same string again and again and again. And yes, that's basically what most things are built on now. There's the equation for attention, but don't worry about that. They're all based on, so you have this kind of framework of like trying to build in different dependencies from long distances using a vector representation of words. And then there are different ways to Okay, so you need a lot of data to train these models, essentially. If you want them to work, they have to have a lot of parameters. And if you want to get all those parameters to work, you need a lot of data to tell it what to do. And you need an objective to tell it how to figure out what to do next. And so one of the ones that is very popular is this masked language model business. So basically you encode your sequence, and then the task you give it to do to try and learn the parameters is you mask out one of the words and you try and figure out what that should be. So given the context, what is the word that should go there? And jiggle around the parameters until it learns how to do that. And then once you have that, so for that, you don't need a special labeled data. You don't need emotions or anything like that. You just have the text as it is. And then for fine tuning, if you want to get it to work for a specific task, then you need relatively less data. You start with the basic initialization point from the masked language model task. And then you say like, okay, now I'm going to take, for example, this token that indicates the whole, that basically gathers up all the information for the whole sequence. And then I'm going to predict what the emotion is from that, and you tune it towards a specific task. There are lots of different variations to do it, but the main innovation that has happened is that you do the pre-training on a very large amount of unlabeled data, and then you tune it on a small amount of labeled data. So this is very good for emotion recognition because emotion recognition labeled corpora are generally very small, and doing emotion labeling is very expensive and tiring, and there isn't a high richness on it. Okay, so we have the same thing for speech. So that was for text, but basically the same sort of idea is being used for speech. So we get some sort of representation of the speech signal, and then we discretize that. So we make it a bit more word-like, and then we do the same thing. So you basically try and predict what this intermediate representation is at that point. So this is wave to back. Speech people love the something to something. That's how you know it's a speech technology thing. NLP people like cute names like Bert and Elmo, things like that. So anyway, this works pretty good. It works better than our traditional sorts of representations like null frequency capture coefficients, which are representations that were built to basically capture the spectral envelope of speech at short time frames. And again, so you have a lot of unlabeled data. You learn to do this on a lot of unlabeled speech. So there's a lot of unlabeled speech there, but there's very little that's actually transcribed correctly. So you just need a little bit transcribed to learn how to spell, essentially, and this works reasonably well. So if you're using some sort of speech recognition nowadays, it's probably like this or some variant of this. And there are lots of claims about this working well multilingually. Let's just say it's not really that verified, especially if you're looking at different languages outside of like the really, really well-resourced ones. Even for like dialects of English, yeah, it doesn't do very well. I can show you an example later if you want. For TTS, for text-to-speech, we have an example here. This is kind of the same thing. So you're basically tokenizing the speech into kind of discrete segments again. So you learn to do that with a lot of data, and then you learn to basically predict these speech tokens in the same sort of way as a language model. So given some before, you predict what's happening next in this latent space, and then you get from that representation. So in this case, you have basically the text. You input the text, and what you predict next is some sort of speech representation, and from that speech representation, you get the waveform. So it's all sort of the same idea that's happening there. You have given some context, predict what's going to happen next. So this came out 2024, just a few months ago. This is from Amazon. It's massive, so it's trained on 100,000 hours of speech, public domain data, and it sounds pretty good. There are some samples online, but it's not controllable in any way. So it really just depends on if you want to control it, it just depends on what it learned about punctuation and capitalization, things like that in the training data.
What do you mean by control?
Like if you wanted to put emphasis on a particular word or make a pause something. And it's also not open, right? So that's just basically what I told you before. So we can't really do anything with it unless you're inside Amazon. Can't really figure out what's happening with it. Okay, so that's that. So this doesn't, it's good, but we'd like to be able to do something a little bit more fine-grained to kind of figure out what's happened and use it for maybe research into how we actually process different modalities. And so one question we have is, can we use these models to explore prosodic variation? And can we use them to explore specifically more naturalistic speech corpora? And to do that, well, we want some TTS system, but we also want to have some control so that we can do some perception experiments if we want to try and vary things and see what effect they have on the listener. So here is a model. I won't go through it, but it's some work to say that this is some work from Zach O'Dari that I was also co-author on in 2020. And so this is basically just learning some discrete intonational codes for F0. So it's a way to do that. And the idea was like basically, yeah, you learn to predict what the F0 is. So you learn in kind of the same way. You put the F0 in and you have a model in between that kind of compresses it into some discrete representation. And then what the goal is at the end is to basically reproduce that in the training phase. And then when you want to do synthesis, then you choose one of these codes and then it should do something that makes it different. And so the goal at that time was just to see whether it did something different. We had some ideas that maybe it would change the emphasis like prominence positions or do something structural. And what it did instead was like this.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Right, so it did change the F0, but it was like, so the first thing was to say, okay, are these codes actually doing some different prosody? So we got people to rate whether, different renditions were actually perceptibly different, and they were. And then from there, what do they actually, why are they different? I'm very into information structure, so I was hoping that, oh, information structure will come out, but that didn't happen. What they were mainly talking about were, well, they talked about many, many different things. So they talked about, so we did a little qualitative study, and just from 5 listeners, they already gave us like 68 descriptive terms of some things, not just for that, I'm sorry, but for other stimuli too. So they said things that are related to affect, like surprise or sad, or the style, it was storytelling style, or sarcastic or insincere. They also gave us some things that were discourse related. So it was a narrative, it was questioning, it was direct, there was a continuation, right? That sort of thing. And they also gave us a lot of context where they thought that this prosody would be appropriate. So so things like it was a fake apology, or somebody who was reluctant to apologize, or as I told people in the other talk. So, it was a brother and a sister talking to each other and not really wanting to apologize. That was one of the more memorable ones. And we saw that the less specific semantics, you got more different varied responses, which makes sense. So people kind of imagined why you would have maybe an incongruous or an unexpected prosody in terms of a context that people would use it in. So that was like okay, what do we do with this? And we're still trying to figure out what to do with this information, to be honest, like how we can map from these very vivid contexts that people would give us in qualitative studies to things that we can probably measure in a more engineering sense. But we're basically trying to narrow down on different types of specific questions that we can ask people rather than just, does it sound like a human or not? Right, so this is the type of model that we're using. And again, so it's built on a transformer. You get a representation based on the input text that basically gives you something like a phoneme or grapheme sequence. It gives you a text representation. And you get from that also a pitch representation. So from this text representation, you predict the pitch per phone or grapheme. So per subword units. And you also predict the duration, and these prosodic features are basically added in to the text representation to predict spectrogram, and then again to the waveform. So if you don't know what spectrogram is, it's just what I showed you very early before. It's a range of frequencies in the speech. So basically, yeah, you get a text representation, you predict F0 and duration from it, and you use that to figure out how to do the actual synthesis. Okay, so why do we use this? This is not state of the art, but it's pretty decent. So in the previous work, it showed that it had comparable performance to the state of the art at the time, in the sense of that it had relatively good naturalness ratings, and it's much more lightweight, and we can control it. So you can, rather than predicting pitch and duration from the text, you can basically tell it, I want this F0, or I want this duration. When I say you can tell it, it's more like you can ask it, and it may or may not do it. But it's generally, it's okay, right? So it generally gets it in the ballpark, but you can't force it to do a specific contour. So one of the issues with this is that these sorts of models are really limited by the training data. So kind of gives, the synthesis kind of gives you an idea of like what's in the training data itself. So so the data set that we usually use for TTS in academia, because it's open and it's very clean speech, is this Linda Johnson audiobook data set. Linda Johnson recorded many audiobooks for the LibriVox website, which is just open audiobooks. And so she sounds quite like she's an audiobook reader, so she sounds like read speech quite a lot. She's very distinctive. And so this is what she sounds like, a TTS system sounds like, just based on that data.
What do you do to check out? How did that come about? You know, I've gotten really used to it.
So it doesn't sound very good if you have like sort of more conversational texts, right? So, but if you add in some data from, for example, a podcast corpus, then she sounds a bit better.
What do you do to check out? How did that come about? You know, I've gotten really used to it.
So it sounds a little bit more conversational. So people agree generally that it sounds a bit more, but it still sounds a little bit weird. And just for reference, this is what actual LJ sounds like.
The examination and testimony of the experts enabled the commission to conclude that 5 shots may have been fired.
Right, so she doesn't sound super conversational to start with. The reading style is generally like that. So that's one of the things, the limitations of the data. And we also have a lot of, so LJ is not representative of everybody, right? So we also know that people vary in their dialects and just in different cues that they use in interaction. And so one of those ones that we wanted to look at was turn-taking cues, because that's been investigated quite a lot in different literatures. And so we wanted to see whether a TTS system would learn these sorts of patterns. And so here's some data from the Candle corpus. So these are real speakers. And you can see if we just look at the height at the end of a sentence for them, there are differences between the speakers and what their patterns are. So for this speaker, 48, she tends to be a bit higher at the end on turn final. So when somebody else speaks after her, rather than on turn medial. And this speaker has the opposite pattern. So she a bit lower when somebody else is speaking after her versus the other. And what you can hear from that is some uptalk. So I'll play it for you. So you'll hear some sort of rise at the end.
But it's almost harder in other ways because your skis are so skinny.
Right, so she goes up.
But it's almost harder in other ways because your skis are so skinny. They start like next week till Thanksgiving, and then there'll be like an interim like winter semester.
She does it quite consistently, but there's quite a big range here, and this only captures the height.
I think being a parent is really ridiculously hard.
Right, so she has a fall at the end. So again, this speaker has default fall at the end.
And it was just funny because she and I I could tell we definitely are not anything alike.
So there are lots of variation in the data with this. So we wanted to see whether the TTS system would pick this up, and it has some speaker information when it's training, so it should be able to learn different voices. And so the answer is like, if we add this information into the model, does it learn this information? And the answer is yes, but so for some speakers, yes, if you ask them, you generate one that has the turn final flag to it, and versus the other, they will hear more turn final. They will say that it's probably the end of the turn for those speakers and the others, but not for everything. And it's not like that far away from the middle point, right? So usually, so in these cases where it's passing this dash line, people said that it was more turn final sounding. It sounded like they'd finished talking. And I'll just play you. So you hear that there's not much difference, right? So
You would hope. You would hope. You would hope. You would hope.
okay, so you can't hear that much difference between them, even though people in the listening test did find a distinction there. So the main thing here is like the differences seem to be washed out by the factors of by the properties of the data set as a whole. So there's still some work there to be done in generating speech that is like individualized and for different speakers and different dialects and things like that. I just wanted to talk about that in terms of what we're doing at the generation stage, but there's a kind of a limit there in terms of what we can generate based on the data and what methods that we have to do the control for them. We can do better direct control now so that we can try and tell it to like put a rise on or put a fall on, but there's also a limit. So like if it goes beyond the range that it's seen of a speaker in the data, then it will get a bit weird. We also know that, you know, prosody F0 is definitely not everything, and we'd like to understand how this interacts with the text and how this interacts with other features. And so I'll give you some to tell you a little bit more about like the work that we're doing in this area that's mainly directed towards emotion recognition at the moment, but I'd like to work on some other things in the future. So I would say like these acoustic representations are pretty good. So these representations that we learn from these models, from the TTS models, are interesting, and they're kind of good for being able to understand like what is being learned in the data, what is in the data, and what can we get out of it. But it's not, there's still room there for doing just like traditional corpus studies, I would say. And some other work we've done suggests that, you know, we can also use these like language models to characterize like what's going to happen next in terms of the text, in terms of predicting like what's plausible as a continuation. These new models, they're pretty good, they're pretty flexible, and they have given us some more tools to like try and understand how this would work from a speech technology perspective. And so, yes, let's look at some things in emotion recognition. Okay, so back to this wave today. So again, we're getting some representation. So we're basically doing this thing of putting the self-attention and some other layers and again and again and again, and you just keep stacking it up. And the more you do it, the better it seems to get for ASR. You get more and more abstracted the more kind of layers you go through. But there were a lot of claims about this, about, oh, okay, maybe this is just a very universal speech representation now that can be used for anything, you know, it can be used for emotion recognition, it can be used for lots of stuff. And so we did some experiments to see how the variation, how the performance changed. If we just look at different layers, so from when you put in the acoustic signal, that's a lower layer, and when you're getting closer to the ASR transcription outputs of the words, that's a higher layer. So there's generally 12 layers in here. And what we found was basically the lower layers kind of incorporated more acoustic information, so they weren't so good at doing the more high-level tasks. But also by the time you get to the very upper layers where it's more to do with the word content, it stripped out a lot of the prosodic and other information which you would need to do emotion recognition. So actually there's kind of a sweet spot in the middle where you have kind of both text and prosodic information, and you can use that. And so that might seem quite obvious, but at the time that we were working on this, it wasn't, based on what claims people have made. And so there's some sort of text and prosody entangled in these representations. So in that case, also, it's very hard to know like what is happening if we want to see like what's happening with one part of with the text with respect to the prosody, or if we wanted to add in other modalities, how we would do it. And so the other approach that has become very popular is to do this sort of cross-attention method. So especially in emotion recognition. So in this case, we have the kind of attention thing we had before, like we can look at lots of different parts of a sequence, and we can weight different parts of that sequence when we're getting a representation for a specific part of it. So if you the idea here is that when you're looking at spectacle, maybe specific frames from a video would be more important and specific words would be more important when we're trying to figure out what that means or what that's going to contribute to an utterance. And so this work comes from Tsai et al. And they're from CMU. So they were really the first people publishing this domain. So it makes sense, like when we listen to speech, surely we're taking in information from many different streams, not just separately and then putting them together at the end. And so here's a visualization of what this kind of means. So this is with the cross attention with the visual domain, I believe. So I forgot to put in the information. Sorry, this is work from a student of my master's thesis, Yating Wang, and a PhD student, Yan Xiao Li, and myself and some other people, but it was really Yating. So if his name comes up, you can talk to him about this. But the idea is that if you do just attention on the text, so you're building up the representation on the text, just the text, you're kind of looking at a lot of things, but if you put in the other modality, then it kind of concentrates the attention on specific words. And this happens relatively consistently, though you wouldn't maybe want to read too much into it, but it does seem to just concentrate the attention on specific words. Okay, so here's another visualization that we're looking with some sort of visual features. So these are just qualitative labels here. So frowning, leaning forward, shaking head, confused face, and you can see the text here. The only seems to get a kind of highlighted at this point. So there's some sort of the attention kind of relates specific words to specific parts of videos. But again, I wouldn't want to read too much into it, just to say that this is kind of how this mechanism works. So one way to build a representation then is just to take basically all of the different ways that you could put these modalities together and do the cross-modal attention and just get a lot of different features and then put them together and do the prediction, right? So this was the multimodal transformer. Again, it's from this side paper. And at the time that worked pretty well. They found that, adding in these different modalities and adding in basically the interactions between them really helps. So that was new state of the art at the time, but it's a really heavy model. Like you're just doing everything basically. So you're hoping that you have enough data to learn what the important things are. But yeah, our data sets are generally not very big. So there's a real risk of like overfitting. So just learning about a specific data set rather than learning something about emotion. I would say that's true in any case, but for these big models particularly. And so what Yating proposed was to basically use some hierarchical information, just to call back to before, so to make this a bit more efficient. And then this turned into some work about trying to think about incongruity. So you have the different modalities. So instead of just making all the combinations that you can, you maybe have like some primary modality, and then you basically do the cross-modal attention over the auxiliaries first, and then you do that to the primary. So there's a few less steps. So you're building up the structure a bit more hierarchically. Which gave it a very long way. Okay, so you can theoretically with this mechanism figure out from the data which is the best primary modality with a learned gating mechanism. So this says choose this one, put this one primary and the other one's auxiliary, as the case may be. And so for sentiment analysis, so as somebody positive or negative towards a specific object, the prior knowledge suggested should be text. But this is generalized, so we look at a bunch of different types of tasks in this kind of affective computing domain. So it's sentiment analysis, emotion recognition, humor, and sarcasm. So the humor one's quite interesting. It's given some context, detect whether the thing that's following it is a punchline or not. So it's taken from TED Talks. I think this requires some more investigation of like this task, but it's interesting. And sarcasm is some annotations over, again, Friends and other sitcoms. The emotion ones, categorical emotions. from some acted and improvised dialogues, and the sentiment analysis is over YouTube videos. Okay, so we expect if this really works that it would work well across a range of different tasks and things. We use some pretty standard features, some pretty standard representations. So these are the conventional ones that came out of essentially a challenge that happened in like 2017. And for better or worse, people still use these because they're a good baseline representation to work with and they make it comparable with other work. But there are many better ones nowadays that people know will work better. So these are kind of older ones. So like basically pre-transformers, some signal processing based audio features, these facet facial features, which come from commercial software that give us some facial indicators. So these are the older ones. The newer ones are the BERT model, as I mentioned before, this kind of audio language model. So it's similar to BERT, but trained on audio. And then for the video, the suggested pre-trained model didn't actually produce anything better for the interim, but we stuck with just the facet features, but that requires some more investigation in the future. Okay, so some results. Sorry, this is a massive table and I will wrap up soon. But you don't need to look at all of it, right? So people just keep asking for more baselines, right? So then more baselines. But so basically this is early fusion, doesn't do that well. This is the late fusion, doesn't do that well. So this is just kind of the more simplistic models. This is a model that basically tries to learn something that's what's similar between the modalities and what's different between the modalities. So it's another sort of hierarchical method. So it does pretty well. And this is another version of the multimodal transformer that just tries to make it smaller. So that was one of the goals of our paper, which was also to try and make it a bit more smaller. And so we can see that it basically does, the proposed one with the better features generally does pretty well, at least as good as the other models. And the main thing to take away is that the models that do this cross-modal attention and that do some sort of hierarchical structuring generally do better. Okay, and so again, for the emotion recognition, for IMOCAP, it also does better, at least as well or better, though not all the comparisons are complete. Here's some examples of where our model did better than the big model. And I'll just play you one. So these are evidences of places where we think that there are some, we could attribute these differences to some sort of incongruity. I'll just play you one.
I honestly wanted the aliens to win.
That was the example from before. So she's, the model predicted that was a positive sentiment, whereas ours and the annotators noted that it was a negative sentiment because it mainly comes from the other modalities. So there's some evidence that it's dealing better with the modality fusion. In terms of the primary modality, we still see that text really does the best for these tasks so far, but there is some variation, and well, actually not that much variation here at all, depending on which of the modality we choose as the primary. So we're still looking for a task where maybe text is not so dominant, but the reason might just be that the text representations are better than the other ones at the moment. Here's the ones for the humor and sarcasm, and here we do better, where you would expect that the incongruities would be more present, except for sarcasm and for the humor. And we also know that the one that's really getting the better or similar performance is actually not that different to ours. It also does some hierarchical stuff, but it does it in a slightly different way. So the main thing here is to say that this hierarchical fusion does seem to be a thing that's independently discovered by other people. Maybe we're a bit late actually to the game. And we need more analysis of the incongruities. So some just general points, I'll wrap up now, about multimodal effective computing. So yeah, these representations allow us to probe some incongruity. So incongruity is a new unnaturalness in terms of trying to understand what is good in speech generation, that sort of stuff. Even like 5 years ago, actually the models weren't really good enough to be able to model these subtle interactions. Yeah, they can learn these interactions. So at the moment, the text comes out as the biggest influence, but that's possibly just because they're being trained on like all the data in the world, essentially. And we haven't actually done that much with speech yet. And even in the visual domain, there's more to do, though we often steal from the computer vision people. And yeah, there's much more, there's still work here for like actually trying to figure out what the contribution of prosody is in this. So these are really like big speech things where we don't really know exactly what's going on yet. So that's a big challenge for the work. Yeah, and data sets are small, inducing some structure can help. So some good points. So we can use, we learn the data with these models, so it's good for exploring. There's many different views. There's lots of flexibility, and we can kind of bootstrap from other tasks. And there's some evidence that there is more like psychological plausibility there. So there are some good things. There are also some not so good things. So it does learn the data, but we kind of assume that it generalizes or extrapolates. Yeah, the downstream performance is sensitive to model tinkering. So there are very small differences in models can make differences, and you know what is really the state of the art. I think we have to make some more generalizations over the different models to like model types to be able to say something. There's no guarantees on modality disentanglement here. So if you're changing something, you're not really sure whether you're affecting other things. It's hard to test theory. So yeah, we need to make some deeper connections with human perception and other work in this area. And I think, yeah, incongruity is a good way to think about that. Yeah, I saw this in a video. So this is kind of my feeling about the machine learning at the moment. So there's a lot of like algorithms, there's not a lot of proof, there's not a lot of theory, and I think that's what we need in order to actually test and make things better. There's some conclusions. Basically, what I said before, prosodies help. Prosodies in spoken speech, we can't get around for it. It helps, but it's not everything. We need context, and we need to, and we can use machines to help us. That's the end.